Hello, friends. Welcome to So-Called Writers, a Daily Planet podcast. This is the show where Michael and I write fiction and try to learn from what we wrote.
That's right, Matt. The game is simple. We have 3 steps. First, we generate 3 random nouns on a random word generator. Step 2, we each spend exactly 30 minutes writing a short story that prominently features those 3 words. And step 3, we discuss the stories we wrote and try to learn something from the experience.
Yep, that's right. And today's 3 words, or rather this week's 3 words, were election, hoe, H-O-E, value. And we saw a lot of submissions in the subreddit, and we're definitely going to talk about those at the end. But first off, Michael, let's just talk about how did things feel this week for you? This is the second week of the project, and I really felt like kind of the writing juices were flowing. It was much easier for me to slip into that headspace. How about you?
Probably not the same, actually. So the first week, I wrote my submission over the weekend on a relaxing morning in a cafe somewhere, and then here my weekend was busy, and I wrote it Monday or Tuesday night in between other things. So I didn't feel prepared going into it, but I ended up writing something that I think was actually pretty cool. So there's no rules to so-called writers. You can fit it into your life wherever, and it's still good for you.
Yeah, so it's funny. I guess although I did feel like the juices were flowing better, the funny thing was that when I actually sat down to write on like pretty late, same as you, I sat down and I had the idea in mind, and I immediately, upon sitting down to write, realized that it was a really boring idea and like wouldn't be fun to write and wouldn't be fun to read and just wasn't a good story. So I was like, okay, well, I've already set this time aside, so now I need to think of a new idea and write it now. So it was, I think, much more similar to kind of how your experience was last week, where it was almost all completely conceived of in that sitting. And I always like it when that happens because it gives me kind of increases your sense of confidence that you can come up with something, and you just like on demand, because that's pretty much what it makes
it a lot less intimidating. And like if I think about a story too much before I write it, then I kind of have paralysis when I'm actually writing it, because I have all of these things that I want to work the way it works in my head, but then maybe it's not actually going to work that way. Whereas when you're just kind of making it up as you go, you're kind of exploring how it works while you're writing it. Yeah. So I had a similar experience this week where I had a story I kind of in mind when I started, just like a vague comedy story, and then I didn't really know where to take the comedy, and I turned it into a more serious story.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed the directions that went. I will say that last week when I sat down with my whole story kind of in my mind, I ended up with something that was much more of a complete narrative. Whereas this week I felt like I succeeded in writing a good scene, but it didn't feel like a solid narrative. And I think that's just because I hadn't really like thought it through and made sure it worked beforehand.
Right. That's fine, I think. I mean, a lot of our stories from this project, which, started so long ago, were like that. They were just like little scenes, and actually some of them inspired some of our longer term projects as well.
Yeah, that's true. So when you first heard the 3 words this week, it was funny. We both kind of immediately seemed to have thoughts. So what was going through your head, and kind of how did that evolve when you first heard election, hoe, value?
The first thing that came to my head was basically the idea I had, which was an election amongst farm tools, featuring a hoe. And then something that I think like both of us and a lot of the submitters on Reddit also like connected was an election, and then like someone running on like family values.
Yeah,
I like almost everyone used it that way, and that's the first thing that came to my head as well.
Yeah, me too. Like the image that I first had was like kind of a down home, elderly congressman working in his garden with a hoe while a reporter talked to him. So as you'll see, I actually kept the element of like a congressman with a hoe and a reporter, but I immediately realized that by itself was not interesting. So I completely changed the focus and change the context and it changed the nature of the characters also. But I guess I did end up sort of keeping the image that first hit me. I had to really shift it into something different to make it interesting.
Yeah, and that's kind of all you need to write one of these little, I don't know what we want to call them, micro short stories. These might be longer than micro short stories, but anyway, these little scenes is all you need is like a cool image, and that kind of carries you. And sometimes you find a good direction to go with that, and sometimes you don't, and that's fine. But
yeah. All right. Michael won the coin flip again. So Michael's going to read his story now, and then we're going to discuss it.
All right. My story is titled The Value of Ho. Ho Hoserton squinted out the spotless picture window of his second-story penthouse in the hayloft of the Red Barn. Look at them out there, with their GPS-guided plows and their fucking sense of self-entitlement. Hoserton spat in disgust as he turned to face his campaign manager. We're going to lose this election, aren't we, Pitchfork? Pitchfork McGee looked down at his clipboard, pretending to study some sort of complex data that might be on its pages. But he didn't have to. He already knew the answer. You were banned in California, Ho. You give people bad backs. It's over. Ho kicked a pile of hay out of the loft. Fuck California. I stand for old-fashioned values. A hard day's work. In my day, farm laborers blew out their backs all the goddamn time, and they were thankful. Thankful to earn 50 cents a day doing a hard day's work. He shook his head downward. How did it all come to this, Pitchfork? I was number one. I was a contender. Pitchfork looked his boss straight in the eyes for the very first time. But Ho had to hear this. He'd been in denial for too long. You're a stick of wood with a flat bit of metal stuck in the end, Ho. You had to have seen this coming. God damn you, you piece of shit oversized dinner fork. You're right, damn it. Ho turned to stare out the window again, so Pitchfork couldn't see the tears welling in his eyes. We had a good run, though, didn't we, Pitch? For a few thousand years there, we were the real deal. The cat's pajamas. Pitch felt relieved. Finally, this would all end. We were, sir. Maybe we could find a hippie commune to live in California, Portland or something. I heard people still use us there. You know, have good old-fashioned values, like you said. Maybe so, Pitch, my boy, maybe so. Hoserton paused as a barren field caught his eye. The tractor plowing it had stopped. There were too many rocks. Or maybe not. Maybe it's time to take a stand. To hoe like my goddamn life depended on it. Pitchfork cocked his head, concerned. Sir? I may just be a stupid stick with a bit of metal attached to the end of it, Pitch, but I don't give two shits about a few rocks in my way. This old hoe might still have some value yet. With that, Ho hopped out of the loft with a newfound determination, a sense of purpose, one he hadn't felt in years. He heard Pitchfork's yell trail off behind him somewhere. You'll never make it! It was dark, and the ground was rockier than he anticipated, but he shoved his face into it anyway. Over and over he hoed, and he kept hoeing. He felt the clang of his metal sheet strike rock, but he kept hoeing anyway. A crowd was emerging, just Pitch at first, but then shovel and rake and trowel too, the whole farm. And they were chanting his name. Ho, ho, ho. He hoed faster and harder, and then before he knew it, there was nothing left to hoe. The field was tilled. The crowd was still surrounding him, but he could only barely hear them, barely see them. On the ground next to him lay his metal sheet, bent and chipped and broken. He was just a stick now. At some point he had fallen over. He looked up at the bright blue sky of a new day, a day full of hopes and dreams of a new generation of farm equipment. Ho's day was over, but the GPS tractors of this world, it was just beginning. As darkness blanketed his vision, Ho mumbled his final words. I'm not a stick. I'm a fucking hoe. And I mattered.
Awesome. Yeah, so as usual, I'm gonna go first. So one thing that became even more apparent while listening to you read it was how great these characters are. The what is it, a rake and the hoe, or pitchfork rather.
Yeah.
Like just the characterization and their interaction with each other, and like you kind of feel like they have indeed known each other forever, and they have all this history together. I think that's really cool how you pull that off in a relatively small number of lines. I think it has a lot to do with how like the pitchfork is pretending, but he's also like he knows that he can't keep it up anymore. There's like an overall enjoyable bewilderment to the whole story, because like at first, for the first, I don't know, like the first third of it, you don't really have you have a certain impression of what's going on, and it's, I think, an incorrect impression because you don't realize that they're actually farm tools. And for me, I didn't realize until the line, "You're a stick with a bit of metal in the end." That like oh, that I get it. This is like an absurdist sort of weird framing, and that was like an enjoyable kind of twist almost. I don't know if twist is the right word. And then I liked I picked out the element where like as the hose is running off into the field, and the pitchfork is yelling after him, "You'll never make it!" Like that, just the imagery there was very strong for me. And I think you control kind of the tone for the rest of the story, and it shifts into this tragedy where you successfully make me feel emotions about a hoe.
That's great.
Like that's one thing. Like this just shows like no matter how ridiculous the premise, you can always convey emotions if you connect through the characters, which you did at the beginning and consistently.
Yeah, I was happy I stumbled upon that ending, which I think worked pretty well, because initially my only vision was like the Ho character, and he was in some sort of like election amongst farm tools or something, but no one cared about him anymore. And it was just like all riding on the kind of humor of the absurdist take of it's actually like a hoe.
Yeah.
And then like I had no idea where I was going to go with that. And then I had the idea that maybe the hoe would still be useful in like small spaces or something. And almost like the whole last half of that, where all the important stuff happened, was in like the last 5 minutes of my writing, where the whole idea came to me like fully formed. Mm-hmm. Even though I feel like it like was my second to last paragraph, where I'm like reflecting about the future is full of the hopes and dreams of a new generation of farm equipment like GPS tractors. I was pretty happy with that moment of reflection.
Yeah. And that's also like perhaps the funniest line in the whole thing, where it's because you're sort of playing with this trope of like, what is it, Paul Bunyan or whatever? That's not what it is. You know what I'm talking about? Like the story of the character who's all washed up, but he's going to go out with one last hurrah. Like you're successfully employing that like archetype, but you're mixing it with this absurdism. So it's like correct form of the archetype, but then like it's farm equipment with GPSs that are going to be living the brave new world. So
yeah, I one of the reasons I like that line is because my message, I wouldn't want my message to be like we're not appreciating old things anymore, because that's not really my life philosophy.
Yeah.
My life philosophy is more like things change, and you can honor the old things, but like the new things are also good and better.
Yeah.
So I feel like the last line pays the proper homage to GPS tractors, or, which are a valuable contribution to our society.
Yeah. Yeah. It was really fun.
Also, I want to mention that like I wasn't really sure what a hoe was. Like I had to Wikipedia, which is how I know that hoes were actually banned in California.
It's hilarious. I didn't actually know that was true. That's
Yeah, like the short-handled hoe or something like that was banned quite some time ago in California because it was bad for people's backs.
That's even funnier than because in the story it was funny just because I'm like, yeah, that's such a California thing to do.
Yeah, that could happen. Yeah, I know
Yeah.
it already happened.
No, that's great.
Um,
Yeah, are there any other specific techniques that you use that you wanted to talk about?
I guess like just another small thing is like when Pitch is saying maybe we could find a hippie commune to live in, and then I was about to say California, and then I was like got into character and was like, oh no, that'd be a sensitive subject right now. And then he changes it to Portland halfway through.
Yeah.
So that was just something that I accidentally stumbled upon that I thought was kind of cool. And yeah, I mean the characters were pretty archetypal, I guess, as you say. It was kind of like a standard legend of the old unappreciated thing going out with a bang. But yeah, I guess I don't have any more. I think I used I definitely used more dialogue this week than last week.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about dialogue last week, and I didn't use any on purpose last week, and this time I used quite a bit more, which is always a fun way to characterize characters, and also kind of an easier way to write things quickly, because you don't really have to think as much about word choice. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's probably the same for you when you write characters. You just kind of like imagine what the character would say.
Yeah,
and that's pretty second nature.
Yeah, I agree. It's usually it wasn't always the case for me for some reason. I don't know why exactly. Maybe at a certain like age, I became better at talking or something like that. Because yeah, now it's much easier for me to have a scene of dialogue than it is for me to just kind of describe things.
Yeah,
like commenting on archetypes. That's like. And I don't want to prematurely talk about my story this week, but like I think everyone is always drawing from archetypes for everything in writing, and or tropes, or however you want to say it. And really, like mastery comes not from like never drawing from existing things, but it comes from realizing that you're doing that and doing it skillfully.
And yeah, using the archetypes to help paint the mental picture you want to paint without having to like use as many words.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I like that you couched it like that, because definitely when I was in high school English classes, I really like rebelled against the idea of archetypes, and how these were things that that like authors always intended.
Yeah.
Which, authorial intent is a whole other thing, but actually, I'm gonna continue to rage against them being taught in high schools, because you don't. The thing is, you don't have to teach them to people. Like, you don't have to memorize archetypes, because all of the effective ones, everyone in this current culture already knows.
Right. Yeah, I think they go about it backwards in school generally, or at least that's how I remember it being taught to me. Was like, oh, you have to memorize these things, and it's like, no, you already know all of these things. Like, as a human, these things are like 10,000 years old. They're like, on some level, some of them are literally like innate to the way your brain processes stories, and then more of them are just things that you've absorbed through like the stories that are told in your culture, and you would recognize any of them in a second, and you employ them. I think I like the word tropes better anyway, because archetype generally refers to like a type of character, whereas trope is like a I'll just
sort of. I think the trope, like the TV trope website, is an evolved form of archetypes to some degree.
Yeah, they're related concepts.
We've got so many nuanced variations of things now, because I think our society is like telling more stories than ever. There's so many shows and movies and books and comics, and a huge portion of our life now is devoted to that. Whereas people have always told stories, but there must have been less of them going around 2,000 years ago.
No, I think that's true. I think when I was younger, I was like, I'm not going to be derivative,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that was
yeah.
actually like very paralyzing because I would be like, oh, this is getting to be like this kind of story, and then I would like stop myself, and that just resulted in me never writing anything, um, it's I think it's much healthier to kind of like realize what you like, and I'm not saying like
Yeah.
copy what you
And
like,
do
but
do it in a new, interesting way, or something that appeals to you.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
You're playing
Right.
in that space, and that doesn't mean you're handcuffed to use any of the particular tools that's like some of my favorite things are actually like cross pollinations between two different um ideas. Like you take, I mean, I'm being very general here, but like you take a heist movie and you cross it with like a dark comedy, and you end up with something that maybe no one has quite done that way before, you know.
Right. Yeah, and another thing that I used to avoid or think was a aspect of good writing is never do the expected ending. Like
Mhm.
just have something random happen at the end of a story, just so it like no one could predict it. And that's obviously bad.
Yeah, right. I think
Sometimes like a story almost needs to have the ending you're driving toward, because the reason you're driving toward that ending is because it resolves something about your story. But the trick is just to do the expected thing in a really satisfying way.
yeah, or you have the expected thing be something that they don't want to happen,
Right.
or you have there be two possible expected things, so that they're
Yeah.
not certain of which is going to
Or
happen.
or do like a twist on the expected thing, but not something that comes out of nowhere, because
Yeah.
that's never going to be a satisfying story if it's just kind of a random ending.
Yeah, I
But,
agree.
Cool. Anything else about the value of Ho?
Nothing new. I just, I guess I'm reflecting over it. I really like the way you did these characters, and I love just the tone of it. This kind of surreal, bewildering tone that then kind of turns into this sort of strangely like comedy tinged tragedy. It's a very interesting tone.
Excellent. Well, let's move on to your story, which was election season.
That's right. All right, here I go. Rob dug a furrow through the soft soil. He glanced back down the field to verify that it was straight and true, and then handed off the hoe to Jeremy, who gave him a nod and then glanced over Rob's shoulder at their boss. In response, Rob tilted his head at Jeremy in a way that would probably just look like a casually returned nod to bystanders, but between the two men the gesture clearly communicated, "I'll handle it." Their boss, the congressman, stood leaning against the shovel 2 rows over, tactically centered and highly visible in the midst of the community garden, youthful Ivy League charm in a calculated straw hat. He was talking to a reporter, a young female reporter. Rob suppressed a sigh and casually made his way closer. He knelt within earshot and slowly tugged on a pair of gardening gloves as he eavesdropped. "Family values," said the congressman, grinning at the reporter. Rob winced. That expression didn't photograph well. "That's what your campaign literature says, Congressman. How do you respond to the allegations that you've been involved in one or more inappropriate relationships?" the reporter probed. The congressman's body language exuded dismissiveness, but that damn grin didn't waver. "What can I say? All those allegations are false. It's election season. People spread false rumors." Rob's lips moved in sync to the congressman's. This was a finely honed response. Focus groups had been gathered, expensive consultants hired. The congressman drilled on this answer and a dozen other answers to other sensitive questions every evening for 45 minutes. "But," said the congressman, and here Rob could not physically stop his hand from rising to pinch the bridge of his nose, "if you want to hear my full thoughts on this question, maybe you could stop by our field headquarters?" And he gestured down the street at the Hyatt. "Congressman," said Rob, standing abruptly, "Jeremy has a photo op ready for you." The congressman's grin finally dropped. He looked at Rob with some irritation. Rob, for his part, couldn't stop himself from mirroring the expression to a degree. One more week, Rob thought to himself. Just keep it together for one more week, damn you. The reporter gravitated toward Rob, who pretended not to notice and tried to purposefully walk away, but he was a beat too slow. Any comment? She said. Has your boss been demonstrating family values? Rob watched the congressman take the hoe from Jeremy and bend to apply it to the earth, assuming a placid expression that was designed to subconsciously remind anyone viewing the photograph of Thoreau, or at least of Jimmy Carter, depending on how cultured they were. Crisis deferred, if not averted. Rob turned and smiled at the reporter. The congressman is a good family man. His values are America's values. The reporter had a follow-up question, but Rob didn't hear it. He was examining the row of furrows he had spent the afternoon carving into the earth. He was no gardener, but he deemed it competent work. It looked good, at least. He would photograph well. Look at him, Rob said. Just look at him. Don't you trust him?
That was great. So there's a lot of... the way I see this story is kind of like a character study, or a window into the character of Rob the most, who's a character I quite enjoy for a number of reasons. But first, I want to point out the title, Election Season, which sounds to me kind of like a harvest season or something analog. Was there any thought into choosing the title? Or was it just simply that it was election season?
So yeah, I can't claim like full authorial control there, but I think it was like that was actually stuck in my head. Like I think I typed that before I realized that my first idea wasn't going to work, and that was probably a much more clear connection to harvest season, because it was like a down home congressman who was actually like harvesting his own crops. So it had to do with the season, but I'm not going to claim that I fully did that intentionally, but I do.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that probably slipped in subconsciously.
Yeah. Which doesn't matter to return to authorial intent, in my opinion. Anyway, it's just like it's a cool thing I noticed.
Okay.
And then okay, so you start off with Rob digging a furrow through the soft soil, and kind of glancing down to make sure that he did a good job, and the words you used are straight and true, which is kind of a description of Rob himself, actually. Because the cool thing about Rob is that he is a despicable profession of a campaign manager, but you've made him this like upstanding, honest, proud of a good day's work person who, I want to point out, I don't think ever actually lies throughout the story, because he says things like he just interrupts and says that Jeremy has a photo op ready for you, so get lost. And then his values are America's values, which is a true thing you could say. I mean, like all Americans, have good and bad parts to them. And then the end, just look at him. Don't you trust him? That's not saying you should trust him. It's just a question. Just look at him. Do you trust him? The answer is no. But so did you intentionally make it so that he was never actually lying, or did it just end up that way?
I didn't make it so that he's never actually lying, but I did make his character generally the way you're describing him, such that the reason I begin and end the story with him paying attention to the furrows that he's created. First of all, like he's taking pride in like making them correctly, and he's also making sure to point out that the important thing about this is that they'll photograph well, meaning that they'll put forward the right appearance, basically, which is exactly what he's sort of doing with the congressman. Like he's.
But I also got some subtext that maybe he actually does care about like his job, and not just that it would photograph well. Like maybe that's kind of an excuse he gives himself. Like, well, that's the important thing, is that it photographs well, but like secretly he's yearning for a life where he can do honest work and be proud of it. Or am I reading into this more?
Well, I don't think you're reading into it more. I think you're very close to what I intended, which is heartening to me actually, because what I was trying to get across was fairly complicated. But like the way he approaches the congressman, like he's genuinely annoyed with the congressman, like because he's like, you're not living up to like you're not doing as good a job as I'm doing, at this. Like you're screwing up, and we're trying, like we have a job to do here. We're and he definitely takes pride in his job as like campaign manager or whatever he is exactly. So yeah, there's definitely the intended meaning is that like he's very concerned with the appearance of things, because he's very concerned with the appearance of the congressman because that's his job, and he's very concerned with the appearance of the furrows. But I guess he is also concerned with the underlying matters. Yeah.
It's cool though that you can read that far into him and maybe have two different interpretations of his, not wildly different interpretations, but what it is he actually values and wants that is not what he's doing right now.
Yeah.
I also got the impression that he's proud of his job and he knows he's good at it.
Yeah.
And the congressman is clearly not good at any of these campaigning things, since the first thing he does is mess up his grin, and then he says something that Rob had like trained him to say exactly, but then follows it up with another massive mistake of sort of inviting the reporter back to his hotel.
Yeah. I'm glad that you said that Rob trained him to do that, because I didn't actually put anywhere in the text that Rob was the one training him, but in my head that was completely what I was trying to get across. So that's nice.
Well,
that worked.
The cool way you did that is you said Rob's lips moved in sync to the congressman's.
Yeah.
And so that gives you the idea right away that like Rob wrote this and he's like, come on, just don't fuck up this one thing I asked you to memorize.
Yeah. This is really good feedback actually, because like the fact that like I agree that it's interesting when something has like a couple of interpretations and different people can interpret it differently, but also it's valuable for me to see like, okay, you got like 90% of what I was intending, and the remaining 10%, I bet I could tweak it to make it so that you got exactly what I was trying to get across, and that just helps me hone my craft.
Also, is that important? Like, is it important that the reader gets the exact picture you did, or can they kind of stretch Rob to like impose their values upon him?
Yeah.
He's a good protagonist character because I think you can kind of do that with him.
Yeah, that's one interesting thing about this format is, just short fiction in general, is the shorter it is, the more underspecified and underconstrained it is, and there's more room to impose kind of to project almost onto the writing kind of your preconceptions. That's another reason why actually it really pays to play with tropes in shorter fiction, because you have less space to characterize things in detail, so it helps to rely on shorthand of like, everyone kind of has their own image of a congressman and of a campaign manager.
Right. Yeah, but all of these characters are beyond trope, even in this little space, which is good, because you can always start from a place, and then really without working, everyone forms into their unique, individual character.
Yeah.
So, there's nothing wrong with starting with a familiar character type and then seeing where that goes.
Yeah.
Especially with these experimental, 30-minute story exercises.
Yeah. So from my point of view, some other things, like I actually, the feedback you had last week was you just made the observation, and it was just kind of a neutral observation, that I tend to open stories with dialogue, and I tend to lean heavily on dialogue in general. So this week I was like, that's true, and not that that's bad. I use that technique because I like it. I think it's a powerful technique, and I like it in things that I read. But just as a challenge, I'm going to try to not open on a quote or on a piece of dialogue, kind of defer the dialogue until later, and then actually not minimize the dialogue, but just kind of reduce the dialogue and not quite lean on it so much, lean more on the narration and the characters' kind of internal thoughts. So I was doing that on purpose, and I was happy that I did that because I kind of did some things that I might not have done otherwise, like little beats of characterization I might have tried to get across through what the character says that I instead kind of made myself get across through kind of how he thinks and reacts.
It's cool that you played a sub game there with like imposing more boundary conditions on your story.
Yeah.
I think one cool thing that effect that had is it made Rob seem more introspective as a character, because you start off with all of these little kind of insights into his mind, like he glanced down to verify that it was straight and true and stuff like that. And when that's like the first thing that you see, it's almost like that's the kind of stuff going on in his head, and then he's distracted by this like physical thing that's happening with the congressperson, and then he goes back to the thing in his head at the end. So I think that worked out well, and that might be a good thing for both of us to keep in mind in the future. Is, are we painting sort of a scene that people are watching, or are we kind of more in characters? Do we want it to seem more like we're in characters' heads, and can we use this to kind of like differentiate more extroverted and introverted characters and situations?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I didn't do that intentionally. I wasn't like, I want Rob to seem more introverted, so I'm going to apply this technique. But you're right that's definitely kind of the way it should be viewed, I think. And I like that you just mentioned that I kind of bookended the piece with Rob's attention being on the furrows he's digging in the soil, and on that work rather than on the congressman, because I intentionally only use the word furrows in the first paragraph and in the last paragraph, and this may be a little corny to like explain, but like I was basically trying to almost frame the story with this specific word, which is actually like a straight line, kind of like a bounding box almost around the story. So I wasn't sure. I wasn't even sure how that would work, or if that would do anything other than subconsciously, or even if it would do anything subconsciously. But
I think I caught. Well, I think I did notice the word furrow because it's an unusual word. But I think the effective part is not just the word, but just what he's doing. Which is like, examining them for their straightness, deeming it competent work, verifying it's straight and true, to use a bunch of your words, and also it looked good. At least it would photograph well. So there's a lot of things there that are bookending it with how Rob thinks about this whole situation. Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah, I think maybe next week, I don't know, maybe it's bad practice for me to commit to these kinds of things ahead of time, because then if I mess it up, I'll feel bad. But like, my one kind of like missed thing here was like, I feel like this is like, it doesn't really, I don't think the ending really lands, and it kind of doesn't feel like a narrative so much as just like a scene. And we kind of talked about that earlier. And I want to, I want to have actual story. Like I want my mind to be stories as often as possible. Like, yeah, I like, you learn a lot from making kind of a scene that doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end per se. But I feel like I'm capable of making these scenes have a beginning, middle, and end. And so I'm going to try not to let myself off the hook next week.
Yeah, it's hard. And the only way I think I ever have a beginning, middle, and end is kind of by accident. Because otherwise it does kind of require planning for the most part, which makes the exercise a lot more work than intended. But yeah, that's a cool thing to work on, is just like, can we get good enough at coming up with arcs that we can do it 30 minutes?
Yes, and this, I guess, since we're done with talking about the stories, it might have made more sense to talk about this toward the beginning. But I had a few questions from audience members about like the specifics of the rules and like oh I did it this way, is this okay? And my response was always like, really, the rules are not important. Like the purpose of this is to get you writing, period. And if you write for 30 minutes and then you're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, I need to keep writing, like this. I've never been onto a story like this before.
Yeah,
then
please
just,
do.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and like don't apologize for it either. Yeah, I've really liked looking at the subreddit and looking at people's kind of thoughts over their work because, like, I don't know. I think
Yeah, there's some really good stories on there, and I know some of the people mentioned that they were either like amateur writers or have written before or whatever, but I'm sure a lot of people also aren't. And what I think is cool to realize, like when we first started doing this kind of thing, is how capable like anyone is of writing a good story.
Mm-hmm.
Like regardless of how trained you are in writing, there's no such thing as someone who's like, oh, I'm bad at writing. Like we've all been exposed to so many stories that we can tell them.
Yeah,
and
right.
that's a cool thing for anyone to realize and play with, I think.
Yeah, there was at least one person in the subreddit who was like, I haven't tried writing any fiction in some very long amount of time, and I thought that their story was great actually. So I'm gonna briefly go through all of the I'm just gonna touch on all of the subreddit submissions and say just a little bit about them because there were a number of them. I don't think I'm gonna be able to continue doing it this way because if there get to be many more subreddit submissions than there were this week, then it's just gonna get out of hand. But for now, I think there's enough, and I really liked all of these. So first of all, Neil Supernum, I thought that was great. I laughed at the ending. It was great characters, and I like genuinely wasn't sure exactly where it was going until the last bit, which is kind of a joke. It's kind of a twist, and I thought it was great. Ren Roby, I cried at the ending. And I thought that was an interesting story because it's very like. Go ahead, Michael.
It's not, I was just gonna say it's not fair to have a dog die. it's not. It's just auto sad no matter how well the story is told. And this story was told very well. The language was really awesome in this story too.
Yeah, the language was great. That was oh yeah, that's another thing I wanted to say this week is I was happier with the language in my story than I was last week. But the language in Ren Roby's story was great, and I almost didn't realize it was a story until the last paragraph or two. Like, and that's not meant to be an insult. It's just like it was very like tonal and built around like the feelings of the character.
Yeah, it was almost like a freeform poem.
Yeah. But then it kind of you realize like oh this is what's happening with like the last paragraph or two, and then I kind of realized that it was not what I thought it was. Paper Prayers crafted a really interesting setting and managed to pack a lot of vivid world detail into a short space. It definitely took the prompt in a different direction than almost anyone else, I think. Especially
which is fine. Like you don't if you have a story idea for like a version of a word that's not exactly the word, then write it.
Right, because Paper Prayer used the word ho in the different usage, and actually Ren Roby used the word election in the usage of like selection, which is a perfectly acceptable usage. Dreamer Invictus created a very atmospheric and cinematic piece of writing with a very foreboding character at the center. I thought that was very successful at what it was aiming to get across.
Mm-hmm.
Kifru wrote a fairly chilling bit of science fiction, actually, and it was cool because kind of using some of the techniques we've talked about today. Like you don't quite realize what's happening, but you have your suspicions, and then he uses a certain turn of phrase, and then you kind of the horror strikes you appropriately. So I like that one. I thought that was a strangely believable future. Funky TK had a very interesting approach of embedding historical quotes within a like framing story of a man listening to this historical speech on the radio. So that really, I thought that was great because I don't know if I've ever quite. I mean, I've certainly not seen that within like this project, but it's just a very creative and unusual approach to the prompt and to the framework. Fujokaji, I don't know if Kafkaesque is the right word, but I like the way this ended up. I like the character's own kind of paranoia and shame at something that probably no one was actually thinking about is what undermines him. That was the impression I got anyway, was like he makes this minor slip up and then it just derails his life because he feels like everyone's laughing at him and they're probably actually not. So I thought that was a fun, pretty
cool kind of complicated character there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Any more thoughts on today's prompts, today's stories, Michael?
No, I mean, when I first heard them, I mean, I kind of had an idea, but I wasn't really excited about it, but it ended up turning out pretty cool. So, you never know where these things can go.
Yeah, me too. All right, well, that wraps up our show. Michael, let's spin the wheel and find out what our words for next week's story are going to be.
All right, our 3 nouns are designer, recess, and shower. Designer, recess, and shower.
Interesting.
Yeah. You have anything for that? I've got a couple ideas depending on which of these words I focus on.
I have some images, but it's not as strong as it was last week.
No,
which is great. I mean, that just means I love that. I love that it's going to be different every week.
All of these words could kind of have multiple meanings too, which is cool. So
yeah, cool. All right, guys. You can post your own story submissions to reddit.com/r/so-called-writers. And we will definitely read them, and we will see you guys next week.